Today, we are engaged in an extensive analysis of one of the most uh, chilling and just expansive criminal cases in modern Canadian history.
We're focusing on Robert William Pickton, a name that's known across the globe as the pig farmer killer.
And his crimes, they really expose these deep systemic failures within law enforcement, within our institutions, on a massive scale.
That's right. Our material for this session is drawn entirely from a really comprehensive stack of sources. We're talking articles, research, legal documents.
Right, detailing everything, his life, the agonizing investigation, the very complex legal proceedings.
And crucially, the public and institutional reckoning that followed.
The goal here isn't simply to recount a terrible history, but to really dedicate the time to dissect the institutional context. I mean, how did these crimes continue for so long, undetected or just unheeded?
It's really a story about the failures of protection. And when we talk about Robert Pickton, you have to immediately confront the scale of it all.
The numbers are just staggering.
He was convicted of 6 counts of second-degree murder, but he was charged with 27.
27. And suspected in 4 others.
And then there's the confession. He told an undercover police officer that he had murdered 49 women.
49 women. I mean, that number, it just screams of monumental negligence.
It really does. And we have to underscore this right from the beginning and keep it in mind throughout our whole discussion. The victims were tragically vulnerable.
Predominantly sex workers, many struggling with addiction, living and working in Vancouver's impoverished downtown Eastside.
Exactly. And so this case is, it's inextricably linked to the ongoing painful crisis of missing and murdered Indigenous women in Canada.
So our sympathy for the victims and their families has to be carried throughout this entire discussion as we examine the facts.
Let's begin by attempting to trace the roots of this profound evil, starting with his youth and the very land that would become a crime scene. The farm in Port Coquitlam.
Okay, let's unpack the origins. Robert William Pickton was born on October 24th, 1949, and he grew up in Port Coquitlam, British Columbia.
Which is a suburb about, 27 kilometers east of Vancouver?
Right, and his family, led by his parents, Leonard and Louise, they were career pig farmers. The family property, it was the center of his whole world.
The sources describe a very specific, almost restrictive environment. The mother, Louise, she was the dominant figure, described as extremely demanding, very controlling.
And Robert had a very strong, almost, pathological attachment to her.
And crucially, the sources note she was intensely focused on the welfare of the pigs. She often prioritized the livestock's needs over the basic care of her own children.
That structure really seems foundational to his development.
Absolutely. And this prioritization, it led to one of the most disturbing early anecdotes, one that speaks volumes about their neglect.
You're talking about the nickname Stinky Piggy.
Exactly. And it wasn't just a teasing name, it was a descriptor born of his mother's choice. Robert and his younger brother, David, were frequently sent to school in unwashed, foul-smelling clothes that just reeked of manure and the farm.
So they were marked from a young age, socially isolated.
Completely. And that neglect, it marked them as different, unclean among their peers. Robert struggled immensely in school.
He failed grade 2.
Yes, and was subsequently moved into special education classes. So you have this lack of academic success, coupled with the rigorous, isolating physical labor on the farm. He spent his formative years entirely outside the normal social structure.
And we also see evidence of some deep emotional volatility early on, especially concerning animals on the farm. Tell us about the calf incident, because it's a moment of severe early trauma that's noted in the sources.
It happened when he was around 12 years old. Robert had bonded with a calf he had been raising for 2 weeks. It was his pet, a source of affection for him.
And one day he came home from school.
And he couldn't find it. He was directed to the barn where he discovered the animal had been slaughtered without his knowledge or consent.
The sources describe his reaction as just utter, inconsolable distress.
That kind of sudden, violent severing of an attachment, especially with an animal he had cared for, literally raised before it was slaughtered. It must have been profoundly damaging.
It just reinforces this cold, harsh, utilitarian view of life and death that just permeated the farm. It suggests that even deep emotional connection could be abruptly and violently erased.
For profit or convenience, it absolutely sets a tone.
So after that, his trajectory was pretty clear.
He dropped out of school completely in 1963. He did spend nearly 7 years working off the farm as a meat cutter, but he ultimately returned full-time to the family operation. The farm became his inescapable reality.
And eventually his sanctuary for violence.
Precisely.
But what's important for you to grasp, though, is that despite the grime and the grim reputation of the farm, the Picktons were not poor.
Not at all. That contrast is essential. After their parents died in the late 1970s, Robert and David inherited the farm property.
And they were astute enough, or maybe just fortunate enough, to capitalize on the development happening in the Lower Mainland.
They sold portions of the land to developers, netting them a substantial $5.16 million.
So they were operating this dirty, isolated pig farm, but they had significant wealth behind them.
And that wealth provided the freedom and the land needed to sustain his criminal operations later on, unconstrained by financial necessity.
So the narrative shifts drastically here. We move from childhood dysfunction to the period where Robert Pickton transitioned from a strange pig farmer to a known violent assailant.
And where the legal system gave him a free pass. The first major red flag, an event that should have ended his spree before it truly began, happened on March 23, 1997.
This is the incident involving Wendy Lynn Eistetter.
Yes, a sex worker who had gone to the farm with Pickton. He was charged with her attempted murder after a brutal assault. The sources detailing this are stark. Eistetter recounted that Pickton had managed to handcuff her.
And inflicted several deep lacerations on her body.
But she was a survivor. She fought back with incredible tenacity.
She not only managed to escape her confinement, but she disarmed him and stabbed him with his own weapon before she got away.
And she sought medical treatment. Pickton was injured enough that he also sought treatment at a local hospital, and he was subsequently released on a relatively low $2,000 bond.
This incident was a crystal clear physical warning. Police had a suspect, a crime scene, a surviving victim.
And a viable charge of attempted murder. Yet this is where we encounter the first truly devastating systemic failure.
Let's dedicate some time to this failure. The attempted murder charge was formally stayed less than a year later on January 27, 1998. Now, for you listening, when a charge is stayed, the prosecution halts the legal proceedings.
It effectively puts the case on hold indefinitely. It can technically be brought back within a year, but in this case, it meant Pickton walked free.
And the reason provided by the Crown was damning.
It was. They argued that Eistetter, who had documented drug use, was too unstable. Therefore, she was too unreliable for her testimony to secure a guaranteed conviction.
So because the victim was deemed imperfect, the charge was dropped against a man who had clearly demonstrated extreme violence.
A man who had weapons and had committed a life-threatening assault. By prioritizing prosecutorial certainty over basic public safety, the system effectively granted Pickton immunity to continue.
Which the sources overwhelmingly confirmed that he did.
Absolutely. It was a failure rooted in bias. Had the victim been from a different socioeconomic background, you have to wonder if the outcome would have been different.
And while this was happening, while Pickton was conducting these horrific acts in secret, the farm was simultaneously hosting this bizarre public life.
Through Piggy's Palace.
Describe the atmosphere of Piggy's Palace. I mean, how could a pig farm, reeking of manure and death, also operate as a high-volume social venue?
It's utterly incongruous. He and his brother converted a slaughterhouse on the property into an ad hoc, illegal nightclub.
And the events they hosted were enormous.
They attracted up to 2,000 people at a time. The sources indicate it was a bizarre melting pot. They drew individuals from the criminal underworld, members of the Hells Angels.
But also, surprisingly, prominent political and business figures.
That overlap of legitimate society and organized crime, all partying on a literal pig farm owned by a man who had just escaped an attempted murder charge, is astounding.
It must have drawn attention.
It certainly drew the attention of local authorities. Port Coquitlam officials sued the brothers, demanding the venue be shut down for violating zoning ordinances.
Using agricultural land for massive recreational events.
Dances, concerts, you name it. And the Pickton brothers actually tried to legitimize the operation, didn't they?
They did, though it was short-lived and, transparently disingenuous. In 1996, they registered the Piggy Palace Good Time Society as a nonprofit charity.
But they couldn't operate legitimately. They flouted an injunction banning large gatherings, and critically, they failed to produce financial statements. The charity was quickly disbanded.
So we have this period between 97 and 2001 where Pickton is a known assailant who was allowed to go free, operating an illegal venue, all while women were vanishing from the downtown Eastside at an alarming rate.
And his name came up repeatedly. The warnings were consistent and shockingly specific.
An employee of Pickton, someone working right there on that property, found several purses belonging to missing women.
And that employee went to the police and reported Pickton.
So how did the authorities respond to that direct, tangible link?
They responded, but inadequately. Police conducted 3 initial searches of the farm during this period. The official report stated they found no evidence sufficient to lay charges.
So the problem wasn't that they didn't search, but maybe how they searched.
Or what they were truly willing to believe about him and his activities.
But the truly devastating piece of ignored intelligence is a specific tip received in June 1999 that's detailed in the sources.
Yes. The police were told outright that Pickton had a freezer full of human flesh in his farmhouse.
That information was reportedly ignored or discounted.
That single detail is often cited as the pinnacle of institutional negligence in the entire saga. It wasn't vague suspicion, it was an actionable, specific location and type of evidence.
So that failure staying the attempted murder charge, ignoring the purses, dismissing the freezer of flesh, tip, it all underscores the extreme vulnerability of these victims.
It creates a narrative of, if not willful blindness, then at least a deep-seated bias. This is the crucial context for you listening. The crimes continued not because Pickton was brilliant at hiding them, but because the system designed to protect the public repeatedly failed to connect the glaring dots.
So we fast forward to 2002. Given years of ignored tips, what finally led to his apprehension? It's almost tragic that the breakthrough had nothing to do with the Missing Women's Task Force at first.
That's absolutely right. The definitive breakthrough came on February 6, 2002, and it was entirely incidental. Police executed a search warrant on the property.
But for illegal firearms, not murder.
Exactly. They were looking for guns. But while they were executing that warrant, the officers on site saw enough compelling material personal items, potential forensic evidence, to know something far worse was happening.
And that allowed them to immediately get a second warrant.
Yes, a new warrant. And this one was explicitly tied to the joint RCMP Vancouver Police Task Force investigation into the BC missing women.
So Pickton and his brother were arrested the next day. Initially for those weapons offenses, they were released.
But Robert was immediately placed under 247 police surveillance. And the critical element was that the farm was sealed off, transforming it into the largest crime scene in Canadian history.
The shift was instantaneous.
Less than 3 weeks later, on February 22, 2002, Robert Pickton was arrested again. This time, charged with the first 2 counts of first-degree murder in the death of Serena Abbotsway and Mona Wilson.
And over the next 3 years, the charges just kept coming.
They ballooned to 27 counts of first-degree murder by May of 2005.
Let's discuss the sheer scale of what happened next. The investigation and excavation were colossal, right?
Colossal barely covers it. The work at the farm was unprecedented. It continued for nearly 2 years, not wrapping up until November 2003.
And the cost?
Staggering. See, $70 million by the end of 2003, and the costs continued to accumulate. This wasn't just police work. It was an industrial-scale forensic operation.
How did the nature of the farm complicate things? I mean, we know he had pigs, and we know he allegedly disposed of remains in highly destructive ways.
That was the biggest hurdle. The environment of a working pig farm, compounded by the time lapse in his methods, meant forensic analysis was a nightmare. Bodies may have been dismembered, left to decompose, or consumed by insects and the pigs themselves.
So they needed techniques usually reserved for, what, archaeological digs?
Exactly. Forensic anthropologists had to use industrial-grade equipment. They installed 2 massive 50-foot conveyor belts and huge soil sifters,
essentially filtering tons of earth, mud, and pig waste.
looking for the most minute traces of human remains, bone fragments, teeth, any DNA evidence. It was a painstaking, slow, and grim process.
And the findings were so gruesome that it quickly moved from a police matter to a massive public health concern.
That is one of the most horrifying facts in the sources. On March 10, 2004, the government was compelled to issue a public health warning.
And this was based on the possibility that he had ground up human flesh and mixed it with pork products that he then sold to the public.
Yes, the sources indicate he was known to sell pork. The revelation forced the health authority to issue an urgent warning to anyone who might have purchased meat from the farm or through his associates.
And there was also the parallel claim that he fed the remains directly to his pigs.
Which would then be harvested. It adds a layer of depravity that is almost impossible to comprehend.
Before we move to the trial, let's just go back to that 1997 attempted murder charge one more time. Because the later investigation provided a crushing piece of evidence linking that earlier failure to the subsequent murders.
Absolutely. In 2003, police retrieved the clothes and rubber boots Pickton had been wearing during that assault in 1997 from an RCMP storage locker.
And when this material was subjected to modern lab testing.
In 2004, they found the DNA of 2 of the eventual victims, Andrea Borhaven and Kara Ellis.
So the very evidence the police held back in 1997 contained the physical proof that he was already engaged in murder. It's a profound what-if moment.
It confirms the direct, fatal consequence of the institutional failure in 1998. The evidence was literally sitting in a locker for years.
And finally, what happened to the farm itself?
The property remains a crime scene. It's fenced off under a lien by the Crown as of 2023. Most of the buildings were demolished, except for a small barn, ensuring the site could never be used as it was before.
So the legal drama began with the trial opening on January 30, 2006. Pickton pleaded not guilty to all 27 charges of first-degree murder.
And the sheer weight of the evidence meant the pre-trial motions alone consumed most of that year.
That included the voir dire. Now, for you listening, the voir dire is essentially a trial within a trial.
Right, where the admissibility of certain evidence, like the undercover confession, is determined by the judge before it gets to the jury. It was a lengthy process because the volume of evidence was immense.
The key turning point, which ultimately defined the scope of justice delivered, was the decision by Justice James Williams to sever the charges.
He split the 27 counts into two groups. The trial would proceed only on the first group of 6 counts, and the remaining 20 would be held back.
A deeply pragmatic, if controversial, decision.
Justice Williams stated that trying all 27 charges at once would have been an unreasonable burden on the jury. A full trial could have lasted 2 years, significantly increasing the risk of a mistrial.
So it was a tactical necessity to secure some convictions.
Even if it meant compromising the attempt to convict him for the total number of murders. And this decision is critical to understanding the eventual outcome. The remaining 20 charges were officially stayed years later.
But the reason we know so much about the scope of his crimes is because of the evidence that was allowed into the trial, especially the confession.
The confession was the linchpin of the prosecution's case. Pickton confessed to killing 49 women to an undercover RCMP officer who was posing as a fellow detainee.
And the specific, brutal detail that the Crown presented to the jury about that confession.
It was his lamentation. He claimed he was only caught because he had become sloppy, and he chillingly told the undercover officer that he was disappointed because he wished he could have made the total an even 50 before he was caught.
That confirmed a level of calculation and a victim count that stretched far beyond the 6 charges he was facing.
And beyond the verbal confession, the physical evidence collected from his trailer painted a clear picture of predatory planning.
What did they find?
Inside the trailer, police found a loaded .22 revolver. What made this particularly grotesque was that a dildo had been placed over the barrel.
He claimed it was a makeshift silencer.
An explanation the sources dismiss as totally impractical, but which suggested an attempt to modify weapons for silent killing.
What other items suggested premeditation?
They found boxes of heavy-caliber .357 Magnum ammunition, night vision goggles, 2 pairs of faux fur-lined handcuffs, a syringe with a blue liquid, and Spanish fly, aphrodisiac.
That collection of items, the surveillance gear, the restraints, the chemicals, the firearms, it strongly suggested a methodical process.
And the jury also heard from his associates. The testimony of people who knew him must have been profoundly impactful.
They played a videotape where his friend Scott Chubb described Pickton proposing a horrific way to kill a female heroin addict.
By injecting her with windshield washer fluid. And another associate, Andrew Bellwood, testified that Pickton confessed to killing sex workers by handcuffing and strangling them, then bleeding and gutting them before feeding them to his pigs.
And crucially, the scope of the evidence went far beyond the 6 women on trial. What did the lab analysis find regarding unidentified people?
Lab staff testified that a huge amount of physical evidence yielded DNA profiles belonging to people who were not the convicted victims. Specifically, they detected about 80 distinct unidentified DNA profiles.
80 profiles, half male, half female.
It raises profound questions about the full scope of activities on that farm and who else might have been there.
So after all that evidence, the verdict was delivered on December 9, 2007. The jury found Pickton not guilty on the 6 counts of first-degree murder, but guilty on 6 counts of second-degree murder.
The difference hinges entirely on planning and deliberation. First-degree murder requires the Crown to prove the murder was planned and deliberate.
And second-degree murder is still an intentional killing.
But the component of planning was not proven beyond a reasonable doubt to the jury. Given the complexities, they likely felt that while he was unequivocally the killer, the extreme planning element for first degree was slightly lacking for those 6 specific cases.
Regardless of the degree, the sentence was the maximum.
Yes. 2 days later, Justice Williams imposed life imprisonment with no possibility of parole for 25 years. He called Pickton's conduct senseless and despicable.
Now, we must shift our focus away from the mechanics of the trial and onto the immense human cost. Let's state the names of the 6 women for whom Robert Pickton was convicted, honoring their memory.
Absolutely. The 6 convicted victims are Serena Abbotsway, who is 29, Mona Lee Wilson, 26, Andrea Joesbury, 22.
Brenda Ann Wolfe, who was 32, Georgina Faith Papin, 34, and Marnie Leanne Frey, 24, who was reported missing earliest of the 6 in December 1997.
Those 6 names represent the limit of the justice system's official reach, but they are clearly just a fraction of the tragedy.
We have to recognize the scale represented by the 21 other women for whom first-degree murder charges were laid, only to be stayed in 2010.
Women like Jacqueline McDonnell, Tanya Holick, and Sarah DeVries. And there were 4 additional women he was strongly implicated in the deaths of, but never charged for.
When you look at those numbers, 6 convicted, 21 stayed, 4 implicated, 49 confessed. It's this scale that forced Canada to finally confront the systemic biases in policing.
The discovery of his crimes created a crisis in consciousness. It compelled the formal acknowledgement of the severe, ongoing crisis of missing and murdered Indigenous women. The sheer number of Indigenous women among his victims highlighted their extreme vulnerability.
And their cases were often treated with agonizing indifference by authorities.
Exactly. And the late testimony, too, it highlights how fear contributed to the prolonged silence around Pickton. The witness, Lynn Ellingson, only came forward after his arrest.
She claimed to have seen him skinning a woman who was hanging from a meat hook on the farm years before.
A deeply disturbing testimony, suggesting his methods were known to at least a few people in his circle. She said she stayed silent out of profound fear for her own life.
But the sources also indicate a complex transactional layer to her silence.
Yes, Ellingson admitted that she had, on more than one occasion, successfully blackmailed Pickton about the incident before he was arrested. This indicates that knowledge about his activities was potentially shared and manipulated within the communities connected to the farm.
This overwhelming failure to protect these women eventually led to legal action against the institutions themselves.
It did. In May 2013, the children of the victims collectively filed a civil lawsuit. They sued the Vancouver Police, the RCMP, and the Crown for failure to protect.
And the result was a settlement.
Reached in March 2014, each child was compensated in $50,000. However, it was reached without any admission of liability by the police or the Crown.
Following his sentencing, the legal proceedings were far from over. The appeals process consumed the next 3 years.
The appeals began almost immediately. In January 2008, the Crown filed an appeal of his acquittals on the first-degree murder charges. This was primarily strategic.
How did the victims' families react to that?
They were deeply concerned. Their fear was that by arguing the trial judge had made legal errors, the Crown's appeal might inadvertently jeopardize the 6 existing convictions.
The only concrete justice they had.
Exactly. Just 2 days later, Pickton's own defense team filed theirs, seeking a new trial.
On what grounds?
They alleged several errors, flaws in the jury instruction, the handling of similar fact evidence, and issues around his statements to police.
The British Columbia Court of Appeal ruled in June 2009.
The convictions were upheld. The court dismissed the appeal by a 2-to-1 majority. But because there was a dissent on a point of law, Pickton automatically gained the right to appeal to the Supreme Court of Canada.
So another year of waiting for the families.
And the Supreme Court affirmed the convictions on July 30, 2010. They unanimously rejected the argument for a new trial. However, the internal legal analysis of the court was split 6-3.
And that split is significant. It's a technical legal point, but it has enormous practical implications.
It does. The disagreement was about whether the trial judge had erred in his instructions to the jury regarding Pickton's liability if he was not the sole person involved.
So the Supreme Court decision, even while upholding the conviction, officially acknowledged the possibility that Pickton had an accomplice.
Precisely. It keeps the possibility of co-conspirators in the legal record, which connects back strongly to those 80 unidentified DNA profiles found at the farm.
And following that affirmation, the door was definitively closed on prosecuting the vast majority of the women's deaths.
Yes. On August 4th, 2010, the Crown officially stayed the remaining 20 murder charges.
And their reasoning was purely pragmatic.
Crown spokesman Neil Mackenzie explained that since Pickton was already serving the maximum life sentence, any additional convictions could not legally result in an increased sentence.
So pursuing another lengthy, traumatizing trial would serve no further punitive purpose.
Which caused mixed and entirely understandable reactions among the families. Some felt their loved ones were denied justice, Others felt relief that the grueling ordeal was finally over.
These final legal decisions allowed the focus to shift entirely onto the institutional failures. In August 2010, the publication ban was lifted.
And the full, horrifying details became public knowledge. The public reaction was immediate and overwhelmingly negative toward law enforcement.
Journalist Jerry Langton noted that the details appalled many.
And the fact that police had failed to pursue Pickton for years, despite what now appeared to be overwhelming evidence, created a massive credibility crisis. The public sentiment was that this failure smacked hard of racism, sexism, and bias against drug addicts and sex workers.
Faced with this condemnation, the police were forced to address their own failures.
They did. The Vancouver police conducted an exhaustive management review, and they privately communicated to the provincial government that a public inquiry was necessary to examine why it took so long for him to be arrested.
That led to a public admission of failure.
A rare and profound moment. Deputy Chief Constable Doug Lepord of the Vancouver Police issued a formal public apology to the victims' families. He said, "I wish from the bottom of my heart that we would have caught him sooner. I would say to the families how sorry we all are for your losses and because we did not catch this monster sooner."
And the pressure from the families for public hearings finally resulted in a government-mandated investigation.
The Missing Women Commission of Inquiry, or the Opal Inquiry. Its mandate was to examine the roles of the Vancouver Police and the RCMP in the disappearances.
And the final findings.
The final report, released in December 2012, was titled Forsaken. The title itself is a clear statement, and this inquiry served as a foundational document directly contributing to the eventual formation of the broader national inquiry into missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls.
Following the appeals and inquiries, Pickton was transferred far from BC. In June 2018, he was moved to Port Coquitlam Institution in Quebec,
a federal penitentiary for high-security inmates. In February 2024, he became legally eligible to apply for day parole, though no hearing was ever scheduled.
His death, however, came through violence in custody.
It occurred on May 19, 2024. Pickton was brutally attacked by a fellow prisoner, Martin Charest, a man with a history of assaulting other inmates.
And the details of the attack are specific and horrific.
The sources confirm the method was brutal. Charest used a broken broomstick handle, shoving it into Pickton's face. He sustained critical injuries.
He was airlifted to a hospital and placed on life support,
where he remained until he succumbed to complications from the attack on May 31, 2024, at the age of 74.
And the man who attacked him was later charged and spoke publicly about his motivations.
Yes, Martin Charest was charged with first-degree murder. He later pleaded guilty, and when addressing the court, he explicitly stated that he did it for the victims.
The sheer scale and horror of this case ensured it had an undeniable dark influence on media and culture.
That influence began almost immediately. Journalists like Stevie Cameron documented the saga in her books, The Pickton File and On the Farm.
And then came the fictionalizations, the films.
From the 2005 horror film Killer Pickton to the 2016 film On the Farm and the 2023 biopic Pig Killer, television was not immune either.
The Canadian crime drama Da Vinci's Inquest referred to the pig farm.
And the season 4 finale of Criminal Minds, To Hell and Back, drew heavily on the key details: 2 brothers, a pig farm, and feeding remains to the pigs.
The case has also created controversies surrounding attempts to commercialize the tragedy.
A major controversy was the purported autobiography in 2016, Pickton, in his own words, which led to immediate government action to prevent him from profiting.
And more recently, the T-shirt controversy.
In 2024, a comedy troupe called Danger Cats tried to sell T-shirts featuring a caricature of Pickton with the tagline, "Over 50 flavors of hookery smoked bacon." The backlash was immediate and intense.
Even attempts to honor the victims were fraught with controversy.
Yes. The 2011 art exhibition, The Forgotten, featuring portraits of some victims, was planned but ultimately canceled due to the immense controversy, highlighting how difficult it is for society to process such a tragedy.
As we draw this session to a close, the figures remain indelible. Robert Pickton was convicted for the murders of 6 women, charged for 21 others, and confessed to killing 49.
The true legacy of this case transcends the monstrous acts of one individual. It rests squarely on the monumental failure of the institutions whose systemic indifference and bias allowed this pattern of murder to persist for nearly a decade.
The apologies, the inquiries, all of these outcomes were necessary but painful acts of reckoning, exposing how deeply institutional failure can betray public trust. The work to address this historical injustice continues to this day.
Finally, we noted that the Supreme Court's ruling split on the technical legal analysis of whether Pickton was providing aid and encouragement to an unknown shooter. We also discussed the 80 unidentified DNA profiles found on the farm. Considering his confession to 49 murders and the presence of all that unidentified DNA, what questions does that raise for you about the full, definitive truth of the situation and the extent to which other individuals might have been involved in the operation on that Port Coquitlam farm?
Thanks for listening.